Well, good afternoon. It's good to see all of you here, and I know that in a few minutes the people there at the reception, because they all are looking forward to today's presentation, are going to realize, oh gosh, it's time to come, and they're going to all come slipping in here, and so be gracious to them when they do. I want to thank you all for coming to this, the third presentation, looking at Abingdon's first 100 years. And I am very excited about our speaker today. I first heard her on a podcast from St. Luke's Church in Smithfield, done by John Erickson. Many of you will know John as that Lutheran pastor that participates in the Easter Vigil with us on the beach at Yorktown. And John had, I think, just released the episode when Dr. Newby-Alexander had a dialogue with her. He said, "You've got to listen to this podcast." And I thought, this is just a crazy Lutheran doing those things that crazy Lutherans do. And it was absolutely transformative. And so as we got together and thought about the presentation this year, on the top of our list was Dr. Newby-Alexander. And when she replied yes, I was the crazy Episcopalian doing the happy dance, thinking I'm looking forward to this presentation today. So without further ado, let me introduce to you Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, who comes to us from Norfolk State University.
You know, when someone hypes you up that high, you know, you have a long way to fall. So thank you. You're very, very kind. It is my pleasure to be here. Thank you all so much for inviting me. And hopefully this presentation will be enlightening and transformative in the way that you think about our shared history. So much has been invisible. And even though we knew something else was there, but that invisibility is what prevents people from really understanding one another, understanding where they came from, and understanding how our society actually has worked in the past. Well, you know, I want to start this conversation by really focusing on my title, because I specifically chose that title in part because, in some ways, talking about race is still controversial. And part of it is that it's not a real thing, even though we think of it as a real thing. And the reason I say that is race is a social construct. It has nothing to do with pointing to your ethnicity. It has everything to do with creating categories of people. Now, that's nothing new. In fact, if you really look at history, you look at English history, for example, in the 14th and 15th centuries, they were calling other Europeans different races. So the Irish were a different race, the Scottish were a different race from the Anglo-Saxons, the Franks were a different race. And that's just within a very short regional examination. The Welsh were a different race. So the concept of race exploded, expanded, once the Europeans began regular contact with groups outside of the continent of Europe. Once they encountered, as they began to seek wealth through exploration, they encountered what we call indigenous peoples. Inaccurately, we call them Indians. That's when the concept of race started emerging, and even before then, when the Portuguese and the Spanish began to make regular contact with the area we call sub-Saharan Africa. They had constant contact with North Africans. But below that equator, when they began to contact the areas of West and West Central Africa, then this concept of race took on a continental association, even though many of the Europeans really understood and knew about these different ethnicities. But then, by the time we get into the transatlantic slave trade, That's when those differences became homogenized. And you started to see the word negros, Negro, emerge to describe hundreds of different ethnicities and people. And you also started to see, although I think that the Spanish and Portuguese got real anal about trying to differentiate people's different ethnic divisions and whatnot. They had a name for everything. If you were 1/2 this, 1/3 this, they had a name for that. But once you began to see this intermixture and you started to see in England the word mulatto emerge, which was a generalized word for anybody who had any African descent, that's when this issue of race started taking form and began to be an important way that English society, even within England and its colonies, began to label people, earmark people for certain sections of society or certain opportunities, or began to limit their opportunities. And this happened over the space of over 100 years. It didn't happen overnight. It wasn't suddenly there. It didn't just appear. It gradually happened, but with intentionality. It was not just because. And the intentionality is what we have silenced in our narratives. And even historians, I fuss with a number of my colleagues because you have a number of people who argue, the first Africans who were documented to have been forced to arrive at Old Point Comfort in late August of 1619, of course they were slaves. And my response is, show me the evidence. Prove it. Because the laws weren't there. The practices were not consistently there. And we would see court cases and laws that would eventually enslave. So you can't have in 1619 a system of slavery and then in 1650 start to see an evolution of slavery all at the same time. That makes no sense. That would be tantamount to me purchasing a piece of property, and then 20 years later filing lawsuits so that I could own that piece of property. That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't follow. So I want to kind of take you not on that journey of how America, and in particular the Virginia colony, began this enslavement process. Rather, I want to talk about the role of the church and how the church was really involved in helping to provide a very clear understanding of race, and in particular, this notion of marginalizing not just people of African descent, but all peoples of color as sort of an other. And how and there were those who resisted, there were those who spoke out, but their voices, like most of the voices of those who stand for morality, they're usually the minority. The majority will go with wherever that wind blows, whatever is convenient, and whatever is really helpful to them personally. That's why I tell everyone, human beings, and I'll repeat this several times in my discussion, human beings are selfish, evil little buggers. And if you understand that, then it's not a question of, this group is worse. No. Human beings are selfish, evil little buggers. And if they have the opportunity, they will rape and pillage their way into prosperity, into dominance, and of course into complete control. So, there was a man by the name of John Gowan. Now, John had two different names, or actually there were three different spellings of his name. And what's interesting about that is it really highlights this fluid society that we lived in, because He also had a last name pronounced Guare. So how we get from John Gowan to John Guare has a lot to do with who he was and where he came from, because Guare was his original name. Not John, John was, but John Guare was what he originally was called. And even that name suggests some interesting connections that he had with Europeans and the area that he came from. On March 31st, 1641, John Gowan, who was an African servant of an Englishman by the name of William Evans, filed a lawsuit in the Virginia court. And the Virginia court gave a rendering of their decision. They said that Gowan was permitted by his master to keep hogs and to make the best benefit himself, provided that said Evans, his owner, might have half of his increase, which was accordingly rendered unto him by the said Negro, and the other half reserved for his own benefit. Now I'm reading the actual court transcript. And whereas the said Negro, meaning John Gowan, having a young child of a Negro woman belonging to Lieutenant Robert Shepherd, which he desired be taught and exercised in the Church of England, by reason whereof, and when you're reading 17th century English, you know that you're in a different century. So hang with me for just a second. With the good liking and consent of Thomas Goodman's overseer, the court hath therefore ordered that the child shall be free from the said Evans or his assigns, meaning anybody that Evans was trying to give him to, and to be and remain at the disposing and education of the said Gowan, and the child's godfather, who undertaketh to see it brought up in a Christian religion, as aforesaid. So that little rendering of a court decision is saying two important things. One, that Gowan's lawsuit succeeded, that he was trying to ensure that he was free and that the fruits of his labor, at least half of them, would be given to him, that he could keep them, and that his child, who, by the way, had a godfather, and in the Christian tradition, and this actually goes back to Catholicism, in that tradition, if you had a godfather, that godfather had status in society. And in the American colonies, that meant that person was a white male who was prominent, who owned property, who had some degree of status. And if you were under that person's protection, you were free. You were not a servant. You were free. And that individual's status extended to that of the child. Now you may ask, why in the world did that situation happen? Unfortunately, we don't know. But there were a lot of situations like that. If you go to Elizabeth City County, to Kicquetan, and you have Isabella and Anthony, who were owned by Captain William Tucker. And their child was named after Captain William Tucker. And he became that child's godfather. And the child was the first documented African born in the Virginia colony. And you may ask, why? What happened? We don't know. But for whatever reason, he extended his status to that child. We would see a number of situations like that. Well, let me just tell you a little bit about Gowan. Gowan, or Guare, was an early Angolan who may have been on one of the first two ships that arrived at Old Point Comfort. And you all know that Old Point Comfort is where Fort Monroe is today. Or maybe you don't know. But Old Point Comfort is where Fort Monroe is today, which is why the fort has created a visitor center so that people can learn a little bit about this history and how that was an area where any ships coming in, whether they were privateers, privately owned, or whether they were from the Virginia Company of London, which the treasurer, the ship, the treasurer, was owned by that company, or whether they were coming from other countries, they would all stop at Point Comfort. And that was, of course, several miles away from the Jamestown settlement, or specifically the fort and the little town of Jamestown, because they didn't want outsiders to see what was happening in a way behind the scenes. And so if you know anything about Point Comfort, that's located about 7 miles from the opening to the Atlantic Ocean. It is that area the waterway is called the Hampton Roads, where all the waterways pour into that area. It's also a hugely deep water area, at least 300 feet deep. So you could get large ships, small ships, all size ships docking there. Not so at Jamestown. At Jamestown, that area had a lot of sandbars. And so any large ship could actually get up on a sandbar and be there for quite some time. So Point Comfort, Old Point Comfort, was a perfect area. As I already said, Gowan was the servant of William Evans. Now, William Evans and William Pierce and several other prominent people in the colony of Virginia went with John Rolfe to meet the White Lion and the treasurer. These were the two ships that arrived at Point Comfort. These were the ships that brought in a total of 33 Angolans, people from the kingdom of Ndongo who were kidnapped. Most of them were urbanites, and they were supposed to be brought to the Veracruz slave port, which is in Mexico, but they were attacked by the White Lion and the treasurer. People were taken off that ship and put onto those two ships. It was the San Juan Bautista, which was a Portuguese vessel, and they were brought here to the Virginia colony. And John Rolfe and all these individuals who were involved in this scheme then proceeded for the next umpteen generations to try to hide the fact that they were engaged in pirating. And so all of the documents are like reading a detective novel, because you're trying to figure out what are they really saying, and is this the truth? Because one person would write in the official records all of this information, and then pages later say, well, we actually had to hide what we were doing. Now, I don't know about you, but, I'm a teacher, and I know if you let a student talk long enough, they'll start with the lie, and then if they talk long enough, the truth starts coming out, and it seems that that's what happened in the records. Evans, by the way, was one of the wealthiest men in the colony. He owned a 1,000-acre plantation on the Tappahannock River, which was right next to John Rolfe's land. On the adjoining land lived a woman by the name of Margaret Cornish, and she, along with her husband, Robert Shepherd, owned this huge plantation. He was a legislator with the House of Burgesses. And records show that Gowan was allowed to actually purchase himself from his servitude. And let me explain that. When you look at the records, you don't see the word slave mentioned until you get to the 1670s and 1680s. Not a single mention. What you see is the word servant. Now, not all servants were created equal. Some servants had an indenture, that means a contract that they negotiated in exchange for passage to the Virginia colony in exchange for food and supplies, they would guarantee a certain number of years of service, okay, to whoever purchased them. Then you had some servants from Europe in general, England in particular, who woke up on a boat, headed to the Virginia colony. They got drugged, drunk, whatever, but they ended up on a boat. They were forced to come. And their contracts they didn't have a contract. The law simply said that you could not enslave them, meaning you can't hold them for more than 20 years. So some of them actually were servants for almost 20 years. And then you had Africans who were either kidnapped or they were sold because of warfare or because of some trade agreement, and they ended up in the Virginia colony without a contract as well. And just as the Europeans could not or did not serve more than 20 years, neither did they. That's if they survived long enough to be freed. Okay, so that's the whole idea of servants. Well, in this case, as I said, Gowan petitioned for the freedom of his child and for himself to not only be free, but to have property and so forth. And so eventually he entered into the realm of being a free black. Now, think about this. We did not see more than about 40 or 50 Africans come into the colony up through about the 1650s. And you had several thousand Europeans in this colony and even more native peoples in the colony. Do you actually think that either they married themselves or stayed unmarried or uncoupled for the rest of their lives? Of course not. In fact, some of the Africans we documented, actually, their progeny actually disappeared as people of African descent after about 3 generations, and officially became known as white. And many of them, there are few genealogists who've actually traced their lineage, and they have thousands and thousands of descendants living today with no knowledge, for the most part, of their current ancestry, of their past ancestry. And so this history of these early people coming to this Virginia colony really tells us a lot about America. That this time period that we're talking about, from 1619 until the 1650s, was a very fluid period. You had some people who came to Virginia as a servant from England, who became prominent, who became legislators. That would never have happened had they remained in England. Never. Because whatever status you were born in, you may be able to take a step up, but never to take several steps up in which you were part of the ruling classes. But we would see that transpire in Virginia, at least for a while. That window would close, though, by the 1660s and 1670s. In fact, Bacon's Rebellion was a very important moment. The 1676 rebellion that almost overthrew the Virginia government was an important reminder about how class and status and race were important variables in the governance of Virginia. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I do want to say one last word about this case, and that is that Gowan, in his lawsuit, understood religion and the role of religion in the law. England, as I said, had a religious system that was connected directly with their legal system, that indicated that if you were a Christian, you could never be enslaved. You could never be forced to serve more than 20 years. You had certain rights and privileges. You had personhood, and that meant that you had standing in court if you were a male. Let me just go back for a moment and say, if you were a male, if you were a female, you were in trouble. That's why in some places in the Americas, in the time period of the latter part of the 17th century, women started getting accused of being witches and imprisoned or killed because of that, because many of these women were either unmarried or widows, and they were seen as troublesome because they were demanding certain rights and privileges in their society, and they spoke up for themselves. And if you were a woman who spoke up for yourself, you were a problem, and you had to be dealt with. And so we would see these kinds of things very clearly in our society and culture. Now, during the 17th century, these early Africans who became part of this English system, they started to see very much, not started to see, but rather they understood the importance of bloodlines. They understood the importance of personal connections. Those personal connections were not just with each other, and the bloodlines were not just with each other, because there was a lot of intermingling that was occurring between the Africans and the Europeans and the Native Americans at this time. Many Englishmen were marrying Indian women to acquire the rights to their land. That's what John Rolfe did. And then, of course, this myth of Pocahontas, I call it a myth of Pocahontas, was that here this woman was talked about as a princess. Well, first of all, she wasn't a princess because they didn't have that system here in this country. Not only that, but she was one of at least 100+ children of her father. In addition, there was no right of rule or descent among Native peoples. And so you didn't automatically have certain privileges because you were connected with the ruler, because the ruler was selected. And that selection wasn't the result of their birthright, but rather what they brought to the table, their power as a warrior, as well as their cunning as a politician. That's what made you a ruler. And so Pocahontas, this whole thing of what John Rolfe did, because there are a lot of historians who actually argue that Pocahontas was married before she married John Rolfe, and that the marriage was actually a political alliance. And yes, they had a son, but that son never had any descendants. And so it resulted in the emergence of a myth of the first families of Virginia, who all claimed descendancy to Pocahontas, whose son never had any children, and whose mother was actually murdered and forced to go to England. So there are a lot of stories that we know and popularize, but historians have kind of dismantled a lot of those myths. The problem is a lot of that dismantling has not happened in the general public. Most people still cling to and believe those particular myths. But these stories really tell you about these permeable and fluid lines in which the division between free and servants or bonded status could flip very easily and quickly. This concept of race being something that's continentally affiliated had not yet evolved at this particular time. It was coming, but it had not yet evolved. Once, though, we started to see the emergence of a plantation society. Once we started to see large groups of people continuing to come in. In fact, most people think that the labor system in Virginia was dominated by Africans by the latter part of the 17th century, and that's not true. We did not see large numbers of Africans coming in as laborers or being brought in as laborers forced laborers in a system we call slavery until the 18th century. And really not until the 1750s did we see a sizable population of Africans who were enslaved in the Virginia colony. Not until then. The majority of people who were the laborers in Virginia were white servants, and they dominated. And when people ran away, they ran away in groups. And it didn't matter if you were black or white, if you were a servant and you were laboring on that plantation, as in the case of John Punch, who ran away with 2 white servants, you see your status and your situation as the same. You don't see race. You don't see, well, you see color, but it doesn't have any kind of moral or psychological dimension associated with it. So then the real question is, what did all this happen, and why did it happen, and what was really going on? Well, there's a historian by the name of Denzel Clifton who wrote an article, interestingly, in the 1970s. And in this article, he said people need to look at the Bishops of London papers. A lot of people haven't looked at those papers. He said they are the most important documentary sources available that really talk about the role and position of the Church of England and the role that it played in the emergence of race in the culture and religious perspective with regards to non-whites in the colonies. Clifton observed, quote, "At different times and places, society put forth rationalizations, elaborate formulas, and moral subterfuges to justify the enslavement of human beings. Adding to this confusion was the need by the church to reestablish its dominance in England during periods of monarchical and church instability because of the legacy of Henry VIII. You all know that legacy. He wanted that woman. You all know that legacy. But he was married to someone else, so he had to arrange a divorce. And in that, the Catholic Church would not allow it. So he pulled away from the Catholic Church and started the Church of England. But of course, in order to continue his legacy, he had to have a male heir. And I guess, fate just has an interesting sense of humor because he kept going, wife after wife, trying to get a male heir. Finally, Edward came along, but then was a hemophiliac and didn't live long. Well, when I say live long, he did not live into adulthood and therefore did not have any heirs. And so the church went into chaos and confusion. The Catholic Church came back. People were killed, the purges happened. You would eventually see for a period of time Puritan rule. And I don't know if you all are familiar with Puritan rule, but they were very vicious to anybody who did not believe exactly the way they believed. And this created, they didn't last long in terms of their rule, but this created such rancor that the people in England actually went outside the country to get rulers, joint rulers, William and Mary. But they didn't have any children either. So they were back to square one. Eventually, they went to the Habsburg Empire, which is Germany, part of Germany, and they got a man, George I, who didn't even speak English, refused to speak English, actually, to eventually be king. And so we had this turmoil going on for many, many years, at least 70 years. And in that time, America and the American colonies were emerging, developing, growing, and finding themselves having to navigate through all this chaos coming from England and trying to have churches, have England send ministers to actually pastor the churches. And it was incredibly chaotic. And in all of that chaos, we would see still this cultural and umbilical cord of England connecting England and the American colonies, so that the culture, the perspectives, all these things that we associate with culture, art, music, language, literature, culinary arts, folkways, customs, superstitions, which are nothing but remnants of previous religious ideas, all of these things were still very much a part of American society, and I think people were clinging to them even harder with all of this political and religious chaos going on in England. And that's perhaps why Americans began to pull back to a great degree, except for those who were trading with England, really began to pull back from that chaos, and they began to create a mythical image of England, a romanticized image of England in which everything was wonderful and fine and great. Meanwhile, the real thing, the chaos and confusion and purges and whatnot, were actually transpiring in England. But the culture that was there and the belief system that was there really played a role in what the ministers started teaching their congregations, what they began to preach about and write about. How many of you are familiar with the Hamitic myth? One person. Even though you may not think you're familiar, that myth is still with us today. People still believe this myth. The Mormon Church, in part, was built on this myth. Christian nationalism embraces this myth. This myth starts with this idea. Now they take, as all myths, there's a foundation of reality. In this myth, they look at the story of Genesis. In Genesis, the story of Noah after the flood. His 3 sons, Shem, Japheth, and Ham. And in this story, this is how I'm just going to tell you like I tell my students. Okay, so this story basically tells you that after the flood, after they started growing things and Noah became a husbandman, which meant that he started raising grapes and producing wine, one night he got drunk. He got drunk, threw off all of his clothes, and passed out in his tent. It was nobody's business but his. But his son, Ham, went into the tent and saw his father naked. Instead of taking that to his grave, he went and told his brothers. His brothers went into his father's tent backwards so they wouldn't see, because you can't unsee certain things. So, they went backwards and they threw something over him and then they left. And when Noah woke up the next morning, he realized what had happened. Now, this tells you that as a parent, he understood which of his sons told the others, because he knew when he went to sleep he was butt naked. And when he woke up, he had something over him. So he immediately knew Ham had ratted him out, and he cursed Ham. He told him that your descendants, your eldest son, would carry the shame. And essentially, because you didn't respect me, as a result of that, you and your descendants would be servants to your brothers. And then he told the brothers what their, not gift, but their promise would be, that they would be the rulers, they would be the inheritors. So in essence, he disinherited Ham and his descendants and gave all the rest to the other 2 brothers. Now, this story didn't have anything to do with color. Why should it? Ham, Japheth, and Shem were the sons of Noah and his wife. So we're not talking about people from different nations. But something happened by the time we got to the 6th century CE, which is also AD. And that is this Babylonian Talmud And the Talmud is kind of like in the Christian tradition, inspired interpretations from the Bible. But the Talmud is focusing specifically on the early stories or the early books of the Bible. And it has a specific interpretation that is considered not only important and inspired, but also sacred. And in this Talmud, it actually reinterpreted the story to have almost a racial categorization. So instead of saying that Ham was cursed by his father, disinherited, and so forth, it actually started putting physical attributes to Ham: big lips, dark skin, etc. He would be ugly, he would be black. And of course, by the 12th century, this particular document, as the Jews went more into Europe, this document was translated into English. And it became a part of the canon of the Christian church in Europe. Now, this particular curse would eventually create what modern-day historians called a racist theory. Because what it essentially would do, as the interpretations continued, was that Ham was not only cursed by being ugly and black, and these were seen by Europeans as negative attributes, but in addition to that, he would be essentially a heathen, an outcast, someone who could never get out of that caste system of shame, out of that lower class, that what she would pass to their descendants would be perpetual. It would be forever. And as the Europeans, and especially these northern and northern-western Europeans, began to come more and more into contact with people of African descent, those ideas became a cultural part of how they viewed many of these individuals. Now, as with all societies, not everyone adopts those ideas. So I don't want you to think that 100% of everybody in Europe adopted those ideas. But certainly, if you are already part of the upper classes, creating artificial ways in which you can keep people bound to a certain class, you would be the first to adopt that. Because everybody else you saw as inferior to you anyway. And so that was an important part of what would happen. But when the transatlantic slave trade began, this myth became an important vehicle for justification and rationalization. And you add another concept to that, and that is that as a Christian, you were following God's ordinances, that God wants you to enslave people because it's through enslavement that you're bringing Christianity to them. And so you would see those arguments starting to emerge and come out of this idea, this adoption of the Hamitic myth. Well, James Miles wrote an article entitled Historical Silences and the Enduring Power of Counter Storytelling. And in this article, he's really talking about these kinds of stories. Because the colonial period helped to really frame the ideas of race that many people have today. That's a part of our cultural inheritance. Because if you understand, if we start with about 1650, that's when we really started to see the emergence of a slave system in the Virginia colony, which was the most powerful and the largest colony in British North America. From 1650 until 1865, I believe that's 257 years. From 1865 to 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed, that officially ended, because 64 was the Civil Rights Act, but by the time these random racialized voting restrictions were struck from the book, and of course some of them have reemerged now, but when they were struck down in 1965, that was not 257 years. That was less. So there's been less time that we've been out of the system than in the system. So culturally, it takes about half of the time to dismantle a thing than to create it. And we're not halfway there. In fact, if you go from 1965 to 2022, I was alive in 1965. And I was a child, yes, but I was still alive. I wasn't a baby. So if you can imagine, yeah, I did have to get my Medicare card this year, but if you can imagine that people who are my age, who are still in the working world, were alive during the time of transition, it's not been that long. And certainly it's not been long enough to detach us from these cultural belief systems, especially if you're brought up and you're inculcated in your home with these ideas, that these ideas are being spread in very subtle and not so subtle ways. For example, when was the last time that you saw an advertisement of a 5-star resort from one of the countries in Africa? I would venture to say, unless you're outside this country watching television, you've never seen one. Most people don't even realize there are cities in Africa. I would encourage you, even though they're campy, just like Bollywood, but watch one of the Nollywood films. And these are, the second largest film industry is coming out of Nigeria. They call it Nollywood. And it's in those films that you actually see a very advanced society in terms of living space, in terms of resources, et cetera, et cetera. It is very different than the images that get pumped into our faces every single year in this country about the continent of Africa. We still see Africa as war-torn, poor, and filled with animals. That's how we visualize the continent. And in addition to that, West Africa is the size of the continental United States. But when you look at a map from America about the world, what's front and center? America. And it looks like the largest, it looks like a continent, and it looks like the largest one when it's not. And what do they do with Asia? They cut it in half and put it on the outskirts of the map. So your perspective is skewed. And it's difficult then to have perspective when you've been indoctrinated to have a skewed view. And this is what Miles is talking about, that there's just this skewed view that comes from a lot of racialized justifications. Now, I want to just quickly kind of point to this area so that you kind of know a little bit about the early Africans that came. They came from the kingdom of Ndongo, which is what we call Angola today. And beside it was the kingdom of the Congo, which was also a very powerful country, or empire, I should say. And when you look at these two areas, you don't see any real divisions, because the divisions are geographic. It's just like when you look at the 13 original colonies, all the lines are squiggly, right? Versus, on the other side, when you get to Kentucky and Tennessee and so forth. And that's because all of the colonies along the eastern seaboard, their borders were natural borders, rivers, mountains, other types of obstacles. That created the borders between each of the colonies. And so you can't see all of the physical borders. They're invisible on this map, but the physical borders that are separating those two areas. We know in the 16th century that Catholic missionaries were coming into both the Kingdom of the Congo and Ndongo, and many of the people adopted what I call a syncretic religious idea. Just as the Europeans, when they adopted Christianity, that was syncretic. They didn't just have a pure Christianity. They incorporated a lot of these ideas into the religion that was already pre-existing. That's why you celebrate Christ's birth in December, when he was actually supposed to have been born in July, because of that effort to blend and to merge those ideas into a pre-existing religious idea. And this is what happened in this country. And the emperors of both the Congo and Ndongo pretty soon understood the power of that and how they could, with this trade, use that religion to even expand their power even more. Don Alvaro, king of the Congo, in giving an audience to Dutch emissaries, he and the previous emperors actually sent people to Portugal, some of them becoming Catholic cardinals. So they were very much involved with the Catholic Church, and many of the people adopted the religion, still practicing their belief systems, but I liken it to Santeria and Candomblé and Vodun. Those religious ideas that are here in the Americas. You find Vodun in Haiti, you find Santeria in Brazil. These religious ideas are simply taking the spirits that are part of those indigenous religions or religious ideas, and they're making them and those spirits into saints or into other types of forces, angels or whatever. And so you see this kind of idea blending religions together and coming up with their own religious perspectives that provide them with a sense of power, a sense of culture, identity, as well as a sense of authority. You would see the continuation. Here's a drawing of Queen Nzinga of Ndongo, who was very much involved with the Catholic priests, but also in fighting Portugal. There are times when she's trading with Portugal and other times she's fighting with them. And she was such a pain in the butt of the Portuguese. They called her all kinds of names, but they could never defeat her armies. Never could they defeat her armies. And she ruled a very wealthy kingdom. Not as wealthy as the kingdom of Mali. You know, the king of Mali, the emperor, is still the wealthiest man that ever lived. He ruled an empire that had more gold, even today, than anybody else. The gold, they had so much gold that they actually devalued gold when they went through Egypt on their way to Mecca for 10 years. giving gold away. That's how much gold they had. Queen Nzinga had that kind, not to that level, but had a lot of gold as well. Now, it was from Ndongo that you had people kidnapped and brought and became part of this original 20 and odd, which was really 33 people who were forced to come here. And there is the arrow pointing to Point Comfort, Old Point Comfort, which is where Fort Monroe is located. What scholars have done then is they've said these individuals who had over a century of contact with Portuguese and with Catholicism, to the point that you started to see men like John Guare using John, which was a more European name, but keeping their last name. They started blending those two together, and that became their identity. And these were the people who were brought to Virginia beginning in 1619. They understood Christianity and the rules that Christianity had, and they used that as much as they could to their advantage. And we would begin to see freedom suits. People who said, I'm a Christian, I've been a Christian for a long time. And even though they had to learn the English language, they spoke Portuguese, and we know that from the documents. But they understood, as a Christian, they could never be forced to serve for the rest of their lives. And they began to file freedom suits by the 1630s and 1640s. And freedom suits, simply put, meant that they were saying, I'm a Christian, I'm a baptized Christian, and therefore I should be free by this time. While most of those freedom suits were unsuccessful, and I'll tell you why many of them were unsuccessful, they pushed them nonetheless. Now, I wanted to just show you this map, not this map, but this graph, just so that you had a sense of the origins of people. So in the early years, in the 17th century, most of the Africans who arrived here came from this West Central African area, primarily Angola, the Congo, and what we call the Cameroons. But by the latter part of that century, going into the 18th century, the majority, the overwhelming majority, came from that region of what we call Nigeria today, that extended to Togo and Benin. And so many people don't realize that if they have any of that ancestry, they can kind of see when their families were brought here. Because you didn't have people coming prior to that who were from other areas. There's even a certain percentage that came from Madagascar in the 18th century. So this first generation who came here tried to navigate their lives, and they tried to work within the system that was here, and they thought they were following the rule of law, but they found out that the rule of law was a little different for them, and that it didn't apply as far as the courts were concerned. We would see, for example, John Punch in 1639, when he and two servants ran away. The court punished them all when they were captured. They all were whipped. But the two white servants got years added onto their service, while John Punch, his punishment was permanent servitude. And so the courts began to look and say, well, you know, yes, if you're a Christian, there were some of these rights, but the assumption is that you're a European. And our law doesn't protect non-Europeans. It doesn't protect non-English. And so we would start to see the courts beginning to differentiate how they treated Africans if they were accused of committing a crime, and how they treated Europeans. But where did they get these ideas? Well, the Reverend Morgan Godwin, he arrived in Virginia from Barbados in 1665, and he said that there was this link that the English in Virginia began to clearly make between being black and being a heathen, which meant that you would never become a Christian, that you were an inheritable heathen, meaning you could never convert. And why is it you couldn't convert? Well, according to Godwin, the ministers out of the Church of England and those who were part of the Protestant groups, the Puritans and so forth, began to argue that black people could not possibly be Christians because God and all of the saints and all of the people involved were white. And so in order to become a Christian, you would have to become white first before you could become a Christian. And so that's that Christian nationalism, that religious ethnocentrism that we would see very much on display. And Godwin was one of those individuals who raged against the colonists having that particular perspective. And the church, he was a cleric, and he raged against his colleagues perpetuating and propagating those ideas. But his accounts really illustrated that there was intentionality coming in part because of the ethnocentrism, but the other part because of economic desires on the part of people who wanted to have someone who and their descendants would be perpetually their servants. Now, there was one man who just laid it on out there, and that was Cotton Mather. He was the Puritan minister. In a sermon in 1696, this is what he said: give ear, ye pitied blacks, give ear. It is allowed in the scriptures to the Gentiles that they may keep slaves. However, enslaved men and women could aspire, as he said, to be freemen of the Lord after death. And he said, it'll just be a little time, so you're okay. Just wait a little while, you'll die, and then you'll be free. He continued his advocacy of the rightness of slave ownership in a 1706 treatise entitled The Negro Christianized, in which he was talking to New England slaveholders. And by the way, Massachusetts actually passed its first slave law in 1641. Virginia didn't pass its first until 1667. But he said, it has come to pass by the providence of God, without which there comes nothing to pass, that poor Negroes are cast under your government and protection. And then continuing this very self-serving argument, because he was a slaveholder, by the way. He preached that owning and possessing enslaved people came because God wanted it. Translated, that means that if you're a slaveholder, it was clearly the will of God that you be a slaveholder, and that your responsibility then was to convert those individuals who were slaves. Of course, we know that didn't happen for the most part, at least not because of the slaveholders. Rather, it was because the people who were starting to be enslaved saw religion as a way to empower themselves. They used to, until it was banned in Virginia, they used to use the talking drums to communicate with one another over great distances. Because this is what they did in Angola and in the Congo. Because miles away you could hear the beating of the drums. And these drums were like Morse code. And they were using these hush harbors, these spaces where they would have religious meetings, as also spaces where they would plan a revolt. And this was of tremendous concern to, of course, the officials here as well as slaveholders. And there were a number of very small slave revolts that happened throughout the 17th and 18th century, usually localized to small regions or plantation areas where you had large numbers of people. But, Mather said that to save the soul, that, of course, slaveholders had the responsibility to save the soul of their slaves, but the slaveholders weren't concerned about saving souls. They associated religion with power. Because in order to be a baptized Christian, you had to learn how to read the Bible. And they did not want enslaved people to know how to read. In order to be a Christian, a good Christian, you could not enslave another good Christian. And so to convert a slave meant that they really couldn't keep this person as a slave, because that person had certain rights and privileges. So the conversion idea was nothing that really anybody did in great numbers. There were some. There were a handful. Anthony and Mary Johnson, for example, who would settle on the eastern shore and own their own plantation. They were converted by their owners, the Bennetts, and they were given their freedom, but they were very small in number. And so I thought that I would show you, and I don't know if you can see it in the back, some of these early laws that would be passed once the lines of division were clearly laid. The prominent ministers laid them, the courts laid them, and then the legislature started laying these particular clear laws. 1667, Virginia lawmakers, using the sermons of prominent ministers and the justifications that were being given in the court, said baptism does not mean freedom for black people. Then in 1668, they made black women pay taxes. And then they passed another law saying, this only applies to black women. So they were seeing black women as potential laborers just like men. But of course, this put a double tax burden on black families. Then you had, I think this is perhaps the most horrendous law that still in some ways is with us today. It's the 1669 Act that allowed for the casual killing of black people. If a white person felt threatened by a black person, they could kill them, and there would be no punishment. And so we would see these kinds of laws emerge that really had their foundation on legal ideas. In the latter part of the 17th going into the 18th centuries, we would start seeing those who would reject many of these arguments. And you would start seeing it echoing throughout Europe, and eventually coming to America in the form of a movement we would call the Great Awakening. And this movement would begin, albeit in a temporary way for some, but it would begin to really transform the way, because it would awaken people to their own hypocrisy and to their own belief systems. And this Great Awakening would eventually produce the Quakers. It would eventually produce Pentecostalism. It would eventually produce the Baptist denomination, the Methodist denomination. And these individuals, or members of those denominations, would eventually become some of our fiercest abolitionists in this country. But they were still very small in number. But it would begin a transformation that would not have an end to it. And so I hope that in kind of introducing you to some of these ideas, that it's kind of opened your eyes a little bit to this history and how culturally we're still in some ways attached to that history. And the best way to detach yourself from those legacies is to know and to understand. So I thank you so much, and I'm here, I guess, to take any questions if anyone has any questions. But thank you.
I know that members of our Breath of Fresh Air group are heading over to get the reception ready, and that tells us we have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions here, but then we can also have questions over there. Dr. Newby-Alexander has to drive back to Norfolk. We all know how those tunnels can be, so we won't have her stay for a long time. But who has a question they'd like to pose? Kathy.
Yes, thank you very much. I feel like I learned a lot. I would like you to please repeat your comment about human beings.
Human beings being selfish, evil little buggers? You talking about that one?
Yes, that's wonderful. Thank you very much. It explains a lot, doesn't it? Thank you.
That's the one thing you can depend upon, unfortunately.
The minister who was from Barbados, was he Catholic or Anglican?
He was an Anglican minister, and he had been a missionary in Barbados, and then came to the Virginia colony, and was very disturbed by the attitudes that he saw and by how people were adopting these sort of racialized ideas, separating people, you know, as perpetual heathens, even though many of these people were Christians, all for the sake, as he argued, of making money through the plantation system and exploiting people.
As always, I'm going to ask a question. I'm working for Colonial Williamsburg, and we're opening the Robert Carter House. And I think that what astounded me that I did not know is this is a gentleman dealing with the indecency of slavery and emancipated over 500 of his enslaved people with the deed of gift.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an irony that he did that while he was hearing the revolutionary cries for justice and equality. So that's just a personal observation, and it certainly is being talked about.
Well, you know what, it's interesting that you say that because, you know, he helped to create Carter's Grove. And that plantation, or his descendants, I should say, and that plantation is a space that there are a number of descendants of Africans whose people were enslaved on that plantation, but they have a strange connection because a number of them were freed and became part of the free black communities. And I know that people who went to Hampton around the early part of the 20th century would make frequent trips. So I don't know what the field trips were all about, but there was a very strong connection between them and Carter's Grove and that whole landscape. That's why I'm saddened that, you know, Virginia did not purchase that and make that a part of its exhibition area, because it tells a different story.
Well, the Robert Carter House it's never been open, And the story we tell is about, and this, we're speaking of 7 decades before Lincoln's proclamation.
Yeah.
I'm not tooting the horn to make you buy a ticket.
Well, I'm delighted. I'm delighted to hear. I mean, Colonial Williamsburg is doing a lot of really important things, such as helping to rebuild First Baptist Church of Colonial Williamsburg and funding the excavation to restore what was taken away when they built, it's not even a rebuilding, but built Colonial Williamsburg, which, is in so many ways is different than what it looked like before. And we still have, I think when we have films that actually give us the smell of the past, we will stop waxing melancholy about the past because it was not a pleasant past. We remove a lot of human odors from our society, but that was not true of the past. And certainly, imagine Virginia in the middle of the summer. And that's why Norfolk, for example, was seen as the worst place to be in the early 19th century because, a lot of is the low-lying area, a lot of trash, a lot of human waste, dirty, filthy waterfront. It was a place where people went to die if they wanted to. That's why so many people were living on the outskirts of the actual city. Fortunately, the city was only about 2 square miles for a long time. But I think if people actually began to really understand, not the sanitized version, but the real version of the past, it helps us to see the interactions of people. And how many of you know that Williamsburg in the 18th century was 53% black? Had a high concentration of Africans and African Americans. And so our perception of it is framed more by today and the romanticized world that we created rather than how it actually existed. But thank you for bringing that up.
I was wondering if you could comment on, to continue the smell metaphor, sniffing around Gloucester and in this area. What's the general status, in your opinion, of the scholarship? Obviously, it's wonderful that you yourself are committed to the Virginia Black history and culture realm of investigation. Is that an active, is there, the sense I get is that with things like multiple generations of escaped African slaves living in the Great Dismal Swamp, which might become a national heritage site, and places like Warrawocomico here in Gloucester seeking to tell all 3 culture stories instead of just one, that there's an arc of justice pointing in the right direction. Is it your sense that there's a lot going on?
Yes, there is quite a bit going on. Some of it is really started by local people, who want this history really told and are tired of being sidelined. And they are connecting with scholars and encouraging a number of young scholars to do master's and PhD or dissertation studies on these areas. I'm reminded, and I found this so ironic, after the first 3 men who arrived at Fort Monroe in May of 1861 from Sewell's Point, and these men went to Benjamin Butler and asked for their protection and freedom, and he issued what would later be called the contraband decision, that within a few days after that, the first groups who came from Gloucester, who arrived at the fort. And I don't know if word got around that fast. I think people in Gloucester, because you had a lot of watermen in Gloucester, They made their way aboard ships and got to, small boats and got down to Fort Monroe because they were all looking for sanctuary. And those kinds of stories have not really been told. And scholars are now starting to look at that and going back and telling the story from a different lens. Because before, this, it's like the film Glory. How many of you saw that film? Okay, so the film was told from the vantage point of Robert Shaw, who led the 54th, but not from the men who served in the 54th. And so it was a wonderful and powerful film, but it did not depict a single African American as a historical figure in that film. They were basically nameless, with the exception of including that Frederick Douglass did have 2 sons who served in the regiment. But it's time to retell that story from their vantage point, because the majority of the men who served were either freedom seekers themselves who were living in and around Boston or New Bedford, or were the children of freedom seekers. And that made them a very powerful force to be reckoned with, which is why they were so revered, and why the Confederacy just about lost its mind when they started fighting and began an effort to try to kill every single black soldier who was in uniform and every white soldier who was leading them. And so, sort of changing those lenses helps us to see this bigger picture. Just a quick aside, one of the things that I recently did an article on African American women in the Civil Rights Movement, and I was flabbergasted, reading more information about Rosa Parks, who was a force to be reckoned with. She was not some little silent woman sitting over there and was too tired to move. This woman was scary, and that's why men didn't mess with her. But it was a faculty member from Alabama State University, or college at that time, Joanne Robinson, who created an organization of women to fight against the discrimination they were facing and the terrorism, the sexual terrorism they were facing by these bus drivers. They were the majority of people who rode the buses. She's the one who created what we know of as the Montgomery bus boycott, but who got the credit? Martin Luther King. But she was the one, and she was the one who motivated the women to keep going through her organization. But what did the men do? They created the Southern Christian Leadership Conference so that they could be in charge and they could be a voice. And so telling the story from different lenses, it doesn't mean that they weren't doing things and they weren't involved, but when you tell it from a different vantage point, you get to see a different picture. And that's how human history is. And that's why learning it from these different vantage points helps you to put them all together so you can see a 360 picture and understanding of our world. I didn't mean to digress that much, but thank you all for listening.
That's a wonderful digression, because one thing we're trying to do as we approach our birthday in a few years is to have a different retelling, rather than just come in and say, oh, good, that group of white men had a vestry meeting and decided to build this building. We know there are people here. So thank you for being with us and for helping us to see different perspectives of what the story is and what our legacy is and what our challenge is. Thank you again for being with us.
Thank you.